All right. I'm gonna retry recording this thing. I'm here with Peter Gregory, my new friend, who is into guns, specifically into studying them and studying how to prevent violence that involves guns. And I tweeted something the other day about mental health and gun violence, and seeing it like, do we have to choose one or the other about gun prevention or gun laws and addressing just all the pieces of the puzzle, right? And then you messaged me. I appreciate it. Reached out and gave me a lot to think about in my Twitter inbox or whatever you call it. And then I was like, hey, I'm trying to have conversations with people to better understand these things, to facilitate longer term. I hope that we can just help our country,
right?
And minimally help ourselves. Like, I want to learn how to reach across the aisle to people that I might strongly disagree with, and maybe not just have this typical talking points, but have more data, more things that I wouldn't know about, that people that are studying these things would better understand. So yeah, I thought, well, let me read your bio real quick, and then you can share a little bit about your background for us.
Sure.
And got into this, but you say you're a PhD in public affairs studying social equity and gun violence prevention, interested in politics, Legos, food, and Dungeons and Dragons. So,
yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was born, raised in a conservative gun-owning household, taught to shoot very early on. I was in Boy Scouts, got my riflery, shotgun shooting merit badges. I go shooting with my friends. Recreationally, I think shooting is a fun thing to do. I don't have anything against people who do that. As far as my interest in guns, gun violence prevention goes, that really started several years ago around the time of the Parkland shooting. At that time, I was applying for entry into a PhD program, and I knew I wanted to do the PhD, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to study yet. I had some ideas, but nothing was really grabbing me. And as with what happens after any mass shooting, or that makes a splash in the media, there's an instant uproar on social media where people, from both sides of sort of the argument, both, ends of the spectrum really, started arguing with each other, and, arguments, counter arguments. And I really just wanted to make sense of it. So I was like, okay, maybe at the start of this PhD thing, I can start looking into guns. What is the source of the problem, or the sources of the problem? What can be done to mitigate it? And so I just sort of, picked that up and ran with it. And now here I am, 5 years later, the PhD is done. Thank goodness.
Oh, wow.
But thank you. But over the last 5 years, that's basically what I've studied is gun violence prevention. My own research has focused more on like state level policies, and kind of like bringing the aggregate numbers of deaths down, whether those be suicides or homicides, or related to some other sort of category of gun violence. My dissertation more specifically looked at the effects that gun laws have on death rates among different racial groups, right? So instead of just looking at overall numbers and looking at populations in the aggregate, it's like, okay, we have passed this law, it seems to have this effect, but does it affect everybody the same way? Are white homicide rates or black homicide rates or Asian homicide rates, what happens when these laws pass? And
what do we see?
That's kind of where I'm at now. Well, I mean, it depends on the law, it depends on the outcome. But in my research, what I did, looking at 19 years of state level data, is that waiting periods appear to be a very effective policy for reducing gun homicide rates among Blacks, and may issue permitting laws or permitting schemes, whatever you want to call them, appear to be a very effective method of reducing gun homicides among whites. Beyond
the one with among whites.
That one.
What was that called?
May issue permitting.
Okay, what's that?
Yeah. May issue permitting is a law where police have discretion over whether or not they will grant someone a permit to lawfully carry a concealed weapon. Those laws are becoming fewer and fewer. What you have now is a movement towards zero regulation, right? Like if you are 18, 21 and can legally own a weapon, then there's no additional requirements necessary for you to legally carry a weapon in a concealed manner on your person in most places. You don't have to apply for a permit. You don't have to prove training. You just have to, you know, basically legally own the gun.
Right. Show state ID that it says that your age is above 18, and then.
Yeah, pretty much. Right. I mean, it varies like a little bit as to what the exact requirements are, but they're incredibly minimal in all cases. There's very little like red tape and bureaucracy involved. Whereas may issue permitting, you have to like apply for a permit, you know, say why you want it, why you would be a responsible person to have such a thing, and then please still ultimately have discretion on whether or not to issue one to you. So states that do have the discretionary power, at least in the analysis that I conducted, seem to have lower rates of gun homicides among whites.
Yeah. So that is your perspective something? I mean, you're in academia. I'm sure you have peers studying these things.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing you are relatively aware of like public discourse, Republicans, Democrats, friends. I'm sure everybody that knows you knows that you study this stuff. So they probably all share with you everything of their perspective on it. And then you get to share and listen and share what you've learned. And so I'm imagining not knowing you really well, I'm imagining you have a relatively interesting perspective on the viewpoints out there and why people think the way, the social psychology, right? And at the same time, you studied things from a policy level, which on average, most of us ordinary citizens don't have a great grasp on how to think about those things, because it's all involves data, involves like, you know, and so yeah, I you know, I'm putting that out there just to say, I think you're in a unique position. Is there something, what would you say to inject into the conversation based on what you've studied? Recognizing that, of course, you're biased, but also
no, absolutely,
and representing and you know, I'm assuming also scholars like you, PhD students, are probably, I mean, do they have a spectrum of beliefs, or are they all pretty leaning in a certain way? Help us understand, you know, what you've seen, like in terms of the perspectives that are in academia, and do you see a gap between academic perspectives and on the ground perspectives and all of that? Sorry, it's a very broad.
In academia. No, it's fine. I'm just going to talk for a while, and feel free to interject if you feel like I'm rambling. As far as academia, I feel like, you know, probably 80-90% of people who study this are pretty much in agreement, right? That stronger, more restrictive gun policies, you know, are associated in pretty much every setting to reduce levels of death, right? I have a contact at Rutgers University who did a thread the other day where he's just linked to journal article after journal article after journal article saying, look, in the home, more guns, more deaths, you know, in neighborhoods, in counties, in cities, in states, and even when you compare nations, right? Like, kind of like no matter what level you look at, it's more guns, more deaths. And pretty much everybody agrees on that. As to the effectiveness of different gun laws and what people in academia believe there, I would say there's a little more nuanced discussion, nuanced sets of beliefs, but overall, you know, this is, you know, just me guesstimating here. I'd say 60-70%, but definitely a strong majority still believe that restrictive gun laws are helpful.
So let me interject before you compare that to the popular level, because so wait, the NRA, is there not a set of separate literature? There's not a set of separate literature that like disagrees with the facts, that says there's a different numbers? Because you're saying that those statistics, it's pretty much universally recognized. Is there a small like 10%, 5% that gives an alternative facts, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So those studies are much fewer, much farther between these days, and they tend to come from 4 or 5 different individuals. The
so
ones that you see,
you know who these individuals are.
Yeah, I don't want to like, you know, throw any names out there,
sure,
throw people under the bus, but well, actually, I probably will. The papers that you see cited the most frequently in you know, sort of like against the policy is good, restrictions are good perspective, are papers that are actually really quite old. You see a paper from Gary Kleck that says that defensive gun uses, occur something like 2 million times a year in the United States. That has been, picked to pieces by all sorts of people in academia. But that publication, it was a journal publication, came out, and I think 95. So it's almost 20 years old at this point, and there hasn't been a whole lot, on that subject since. And another paper that's cited a lot is the More Guns, More Crime article that John Lott did. Again, I think that was 97. So, again, you're approaching, 2 decades since this paper was originally released. But those 2 papers, I think more than anything else, is what's commonly cited sort of against the no gun laws work perspective, even like, brand new top of the line stuff that's coming out, this year, last year, and really hasn't aged at all.
So yeah, okay. So getting back to, so let's grant that, say that you're right, and I don't know, so I'm just assuming you're right.
Right. Yeah.
And then let's even grant that that is a right perspective. That more. What is the difference, if there is? I'm just assuming there's a difference between what you see in the conversations had by these in those circles, and then the on the ground circles of like just people shooting the breeze and talking about guns, and someone brings it up, like, why you love guns, and like, I don't want them to take my freedoms. Like, the conversation you see in ordinary citizens, the kinds of people that come and talk to you about it, your friends or whatever. What do you see gap, or like, and what kind of things would you like to see enter into the public consciousness based on what you've learned? Yeah.
So I think as far as just talking to regular people on the ground, there is a bit of a decoupling when you look at like polls, for instance. Depending on what questions are asked, you're gonna get like wildly different kinds of responses, right? So if you just ask like random everyday people, do you think there generally needs to be more gun laws in this country, fewer gun laws, whatever, it's closer to about like half and half. Some people say it's good, some people say there should be more, but it's kind of like a stalemate, honestly. But if you get more specific and you're asked, do you think this kind of law should be adopted, or this kind of law should be adopted, there's way more variation. And so things like universal background checks, red flag laws, things of that nature have upwards of 80% support very, very consistently.
Yeah.
And those are also some of the laws that are most supported by the scientific evidence as well. And so there's a connect, but just talking to random people, most people are like, yeah, background checks are good. People who are dangerous shouldn't have access to weapons. Other than that, I like my guns and I would like to be able to keep, purchasing them, storing them, using them. And the disconnect, I think, is when you get like the loudest voices on either side of the spectrum just like yelling at each other that, that's not going to work. You have to, basically concede to all our demands.
Interesting. So most of your work is then oriented around policy. It's not, you're not thinking about cultural dimensions of like, why is it that we've gotten to this point,
Right. There's like an element of that in my research. You can't really escape it. Gun violence has been studied from all sorts of angles. I think this might actually be helpful in conversations. One of the things that has been helpful to me is sort of breaking down gun violence into categories, right? And so you can say the risk factors for this kind of gun violence are different from the risk factors for this kind of gun violence. And so when people are like, well, that won't solve the problem, you can say, right, but it'll solve this slice of the problem, or may at least help. So for instance, I like to break down gun violence into 4 categories, right? You have sort of the very much newsworthy, very much like peddled by the news mass shootings, which are just like these horribly tragic, but honestly, somewhat rare events that do ultimately account for maybe 1-2% of deaths every year. Then you have gun homicides that sort of stemmed from domestic violence situations, violence that occurs within the home. You have gun homicides that are part of community violence, and I think that's what people tend to think of, most readily when gun violence is raised as an issue. They tend to think of crime, gangs, things that happen on the street,
drugs,
and then in addition to right, all those sort of things, and then lastly you have gun suicides, and you could probably break those down into even more specific categories if you wanted to. But the main point, right, is that gun violence is sort of an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of actually different kinds of violence. And since they're different kinds of violence, they have different causes, different risks involved. Right. And so there's lots of things that can be done to mitigate gun violence sort of like as a whole. But at the same time, you're only ever going to be really addressing a part of that whole unless you are going after sort of the thing that's involved in every gun violence act, which is the gun.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So from the policy perspective, or like what your guys' general, you see like, yes, it's important when it comes to inner city gun violence. Like we need to be investing in the communities. We need to be finding ways to talk about.
Absolutely. Like,
yes. Abuse, we need to be working on relationships. Yes. In suicide prevention, that's mental health and all these things. Yes. We need to be thinking about these mass shooters. What is,
right? Are we looking at like, masculinity, bullying, like those things, like they do play a role, like, and studies are out there to substantiate that. It's just, there are so many things that can be done in like each subject area to like help mitigate the risk of violence occurring. And to the extent possible, I think that you should try to like push for as much as you can as like every solution possible. At the same time, most states, decision makers, nonprofits, people who are working on this have very, very limited set of resources at their disposal, and so it's hard to take that kind of comprehensive approach, right? With limited resources, you sort of have to pick the thing that you think is going to make the most impact. And so, you see me tweet, it's the guns over and over. I don't mean it's only the guns. There are other things that contribute to violence besides the weapon. But the literature basically says that guns are so deadly that like any situation that they're in are going to make the situation potentially much more lethal. So, and that's one of those things, like I said, where like since guns are like the common denominator in literally every kind of gun violence, like if you try to restrict those, you're going to help every single category of gun violence.
So I'm picturing like a graph where it's like what caused this situation, right? And the factors that cause any situation are so many, but like if it's like,
right,
it's like a pie, right? And it's like there's this part, there's this part, there's this part. And you're saying, when you're saying it's the guns, you're saying this big pie piece, huge pie piece. And then you're saying for all these 4 different buckets, when you look at those 4
right.
buckets, you're saying the gun part of it is a big glaring pie piece. That's your like.
You could even think of it as like a Venn diagram, right? Where you have sort of like the kinds of violence, and then the guns is going to fill in probably like, I don't know, it probably depends a little bit on which one, but 60-70% is if I was just going to like randomly make a diagram, I would say that the guns circle overlaps with about 60-70% of all the other circles.
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Like there's so many things you can study that when you bring in, like everybody wants to talk to you, and then they're like, oh, I didn't know about that. I'm really thankful for what you have to share. But I imagine that what you're studying, right? Because this issue brings up such strong feelings,
right?
Like, it's almost like people want to. I imagine that if you bring up, oh, I study this, people immediately go into it, defensive / aggressive.
Yeah,
you're like, I want to tell you, or what do you really think? But I wonder. It's like, how do you, like, it's clear that we need people that are helping us with the, I don't know, cold hard data, if you want to see it that way. Like, to like in any argument that seems like intractable, we need the people that beyond the rhetoric actually zero in and like look at the nitty gritty, right? The numbers, right? Mm-hmm. Right. But then at the same time, I can imagine it being really hard because like, you're trying to bring in something that helps with the conversation, but it's once it starts to lean a certain way, that it favors these people. Well, okay, let's use this data as a weapon against this other view, is how it can be seen. And then those people run away and like, oh no, or like, nope, that's just biased or whatever, right? So I'm just imagining the frustrations that you must feel. I'm just trying to get in your head a little bit, kind of walk us through. I don't know, walk us through what it's like to be in your position, and like, how do you see how to use your social role, and like, obviously you agreed to talk to me, so it must be that you guys feel like you see things that need to be said, added to the conversation, and it probably is frustrating, and you want to get this information out there, but it's so toxic, the conversation. Can I really make a difference given the way lines are drawn, and the way what I have to say, how it will be received, right? Yeah.
It is frustrating at times. I found that, kind of like I said, like most people, like, if asked about like a specific kind of policy, right, 80-90% of the time, will say that, yeah, they support background checks, they support extreme risk protection orders, red flag laws, what have you. And that includes Republicans most of the time. That includes gun owners most of the time. And so the really big thing that's frustrating for me isn't so much the public dialogue that kind of like goes on between like individuals, because I mean the most, what do you want to call it, the most radical voices, right? The people with like the hardest set opinions are probably always going to be the loudest in any space. And given the amount of agreement that does exist, a lot of the like fights that you see on social media, I think, kind of like give a false impression of how divided the country is.
Yeah.
And so that's frustrating. As someone who would like to see policy changes made, what's more frustrating is just sort of how I want to be seen as sort of, impartial, driven by the data. And, I try to be that, but because of the intractability of like the GOP, much more so than Democrats on this issue, it's hard to not come off as, basically completely partisan on the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, anything you say is like, oh, well, you're just an academic Democrat shill, when it's just like, like personal politics aside, I'm just trying to say like what the data say,
Yeah. That's a hard position to be. Help me understand what people are seeing if they're projecting the way that we move forward on all this, right? You have agendas. You guys, I'm sure, as academics, are actually trying to affect policy, and I'm sure you get cited for policy, right? For making these things. Right. So that's one part. I mean, what are if you want to say, what are the puzzle pieces that need to take place? Assuming right now in our conversation, I'm assuming you're right, and other people I talk to may not agree on this. I just want to
agree, right?
I'm trying to not be too, but that's assuming you're right that these that policies like this, and you could articulate which kind of policies you think need to happen. What do you think are the steps? Because it sounds like basically where we're at now, as you've articulated, is that 80-90% of Americans kind of, if you ask them their opinion, they would be down to have certain new things put in place that aren't existing in place. So, and 80-90%, probably 100% of Americans are all like, what the heck is going on after all of these episodes? And so what is the gap, and what are the strategies to fill that gap?
And see, this is where, I get in even more trouble for coming across looking as like this partisan hack, right? Because what would be best, right? Like what would probably be most effective from a policy situation, right, is federal level legislation. Because one of the things that happens with state level policies is that there's sort of, you could call it bleed between state borders, right? So if you have like a state with really, really strong gun laws next to a state with really, really weak gun laws, then the fact that the weak gun laws are next to the strong gun laws sort of detracts from like their overall effectiveness, right? Like the state's just right there. yeah, cross the border, do whatever, and you see that a lot in places like Chicago, where, the state or Chicago itself have really strong gun laws in place, but Indiana, which has much weaker laws, is literally just like right there. It's, a 25-minute drive away. And so what would be most effective is federal level legislation. And in order for that to happen, you need something that can be passed in the House. Lots of things have been passed in the House, but you also need something that can be passed in the Senate and that can kind of overcome the filibuster, the 60-vote threshold. And that's hard for a number of reasons, sort of like given the way that representation in the Senate is apportioned, there's a very large bias towards smaller Republican states. And so kind of getting over that 60-vote threshold with pretty much unanimous GOP opposition against anything new, as far as gun policy goes, is pretty much impossible.
Are there?
And so, I mean, so you have, a couple of options there, which is basically, out organize, out fundraise, get people to turn out, vote for candidates that, aren't opposed to new gun policies, but that's hard because there's like sort of like a built-in bias in as far as the Senate goes against Democrats on this point. Your only other option, I think, is getting rid of the filibuster so that you don't have to, beat that threshold anymore. But that in and of itself opens up like a whole new can of worms and is just hugely controversial by itself.
Are there any senators that have expressed some openness to rethinking, or is it?
There are some. Like I won't say it's, all GOP members are completely opposed to anything new, but enough are that it's going to be hard to get anything through right now. And in the past, you had senators from Pennsylvania and Florida, like one or two, kind of open to the idea of enhanced background checks for private sales, things like that. There's always talk of new restrictions on gun access by the mentally ill, even though, as I pointed out, at least as far as interpersonal violence goes, I don't think there's really that's really going to do much. So, I mean, there is some openness, but the middle ground is very small and it's inhabited by very few people.
How do you in America, we have this story of like freedom and this kind of sense. I know this maybe, this is a more cultural conversation question, but
sure.
We have the sense of freedom and like anything, don't tread on me, right? Don't
right.
Don't add restrictions. Don't add restrictions so that this government has more control over me. We have people that imagine that there could be a time when I need to bring my guns out and just me and my family and my neighbors defend against whatever forces are out there.
Right.
And perhaps even left and right, there is maybe more of a sense of like the future is unknown. Whoever's in charge, I mean, it'll be different sides would view it differently, right? Like the crazy right or the crazy left, they would view it, right?
Yeah.
Sides being in charge will be in some future where the only people I can really trust are the people around me, and my community and my people, right? So that's the story. I mean, that's how I see a lot of, us where we are, and so I don't know, maybe, do you think that people like, I don't even know if I think where I'm standing, I could even imagine collective action to pass something as controversial as gun.
Right.
It would take so much to convince us that that's even helpful, given the story of how we look at it. That could even help, especially if we can come up with scenarios where, like, no, the gun law, even if you were right, it's not going to change XYZ things that are really the problems that cause it, like these crazy mental health things or like the crazy crime in our cities. And So I see how it's our almost pessimism about our country
Right.
Could make it so that we're just like, I don't know,
like on this issue too, right? Like,
yeah,
given the level of, I guess, support that there is for certain policies, not all, but like some of the ones I've talked about.
and that's
I feel like there has to be like this sort of like, well, we're not being represented, like the system isn't working, like what's the point of trying, given how much support there is for these things but how little movement there is.
Yeah, exactly. And so into that, what do we do? I mean, like, I could see one little strand of what you've been saying that could be helpful is like maybe magnifying the voice of, keep hammering 89% of us agree, 80 or 90% of agree that this kind of thing could happen. Like maybe taking away the pessimism, would that help? I mean, because maybe I enter into this almost with a sense of despair, even with myself having certain intuitions, but like open to changing my mind. But I have a sense of despair that around me, it seems like everybody just is like, well, nothing's going to change.
I don't know. As far as like fixing the sort of the pessimism like you're talking about, I have intuitions myself. I think this gets more into political science, sociology. Like, how do you basically get huge systems to change from the ground up?
Yes.
And that's not my area of expertise. But my intuition, like you said, is to just hammer home like what we agree on, kind of like you said, right? Like, no, like people who don't support this thing are like a tiny minority, like 10-15% of people in the country, right? Why are we listening to them? Like, if 85-90% of us agree, we should be able to elect representatives that represent us. So hammer home on that. And then something that I've really tried to like hammer home in conversations, just like one-on-one with people, is in addition to like how much agreement there is, right? Like responsible gun owners, I don't think I've met a single responsible gun owner who is opposed to laws that promote responsibility, right? So you talk about like safe storage laws. Like if you talk to any gun owner, ask any gun owner, right? Like what safe storage practices are for a gun, they should be able to tell you. That said, not every person, stores their gun in a responsible way. So responsible gun owners, I think, would be in favor of laws that require you to do that because they're already doing it, right?
Right. Yeah. Help us think about the systems. So like from the ordinary person's perspective, I don't think we always, like once you start saying a systems level, you lost me, right? I just
right, yeah.
think that system, the system, we can't do anything about it, right? It just overwhelms us, right? But we're also pretty ignorant of them, or we have like a very impressionistic picture, right? So like we'll be like the NRA is the big bad guy, and I don't know much about it. I don't know much about it except to just imagine these kind of like shadowy cabals of people with money. That's the left wing, obviously. That's the left wing perspective.
Right.
And then on the right wing perspective, you hear things like, well, the NRA, they helped fund like the
educational programs,
when
licensing programs, things like that.
They actually gave us money and stuff. So I wonder if you can, I mean, that's one thing, like the political systems, you already kind of alluded to that with the Senate, but just help us understand certain systems, things that for that would help educate an ordinary citizen to understand what's in play here.
Well, as far as the NRA goes, I mean, they're talked up to be this like big bad influence in Washington, and I think personal opinion here is that they are, and that the evidence suggests that they are. But one of the things that's often kind of like thrown back as a rebuttal is that relative to like pharmaceutical companies, right, they actually donate a lot less money to like political candidates, than the pharmaceutical companies do. So it's like, oh, well, I mean, is it really the NRA that's in charge here? But where I think the influence lies isn't so much in the money. Like there is that, but it's not so much in the money. It's in the sort of like agreed upon partnership triangle, if you will, between like political candidates, the NRA, and gun manufacturers, gun sellers. There's a really interesting book that was released, I think this year, and I might be pronouncing his name wrong, but it's by a man named Ryan Busey, something like that. and it's called Gunfight, and he is, you know, longtime member of the gun industry, like ran a company, was very, very sort of like high up in the ranks there, received like awards from the NRA. And basically what he details in that book, right, is sort of a shift since, you know, the 80s and 90s from, you know, a focus on sort of, you know, again, you know, sensible legislation and the NRA being, you know, at least moderately supportive for some changes, to just a very, very intently like, no, hold the line, we will not make changes. It's not guns, it's not gun laws. And, you know, he details that from his perspective inside of, you know, the gun industry, and says that's basically the NRA accumulated so much cultural power that if anybody stepped out of line, they could like issue a statement, and a gun manufacturer or a gun maker, gun seller who wasn't like towing the line could immediately just be put out of business, boycotted, and they're gone, right? And so because of that, you know, the NRA, you know, wields an immense amount of influence, because honestly, profit margins in the gun industry are very small. So even if you have like a small portion of people boycotting you, which they will do if the NRA says to do it, like your business is toast. And so businesses have this sort of conflict of interest, right? Where, yeah, maybe they want to be, you know, responsible and market their weapons in a responsible way, but they also have to sell guns, right? Like they have to sell guns.
So they're not,
and guns are like durable goods too. Like they don't like just sort of break after a year. And so the way that you keep
like
selling guns,
where you can, it's not like
right.
iPhones where you can keep releasing a new one and then like your screen breaks. I've never thought
right.
about
Well, I mean, like you can, right? But like you see pictures on the internet of people with like, you know, 50 guns or whatever, and some people do have collections like that. But I mean, most people, you have a couple of guns, you know, maybe a couple of handguns, a couple of rifles, you know, a shotgun or two, you know, and you know, you don't really need more than that. So like, how do you keep getting like a lot of people to buy weapons? Well, you keep allowing things like mass shootings that drive up sales, right, to happen.
So
or at least that's sort of.
You're saying after a mass shooting,
sorry.
You're saying after a mass shooting, lots of people buy guns.
Oh yeah. Anytime there's like any kind of like civil unrest, anytime there's sort of like a thing in the media that makes people afraid, gun purchases like skyrocket, like go through the roof. So like all during 2020, 2021, like as coronavirus like started and has continued, gun sales have been just like astronomically high.
Yeah, I knew that. Yeah, and we've seen it in Philadelphia. The gun violence has exploded during COVID. So that's really fascinating. So you're saying NRA, the piece that blew my mind that you just said just now was that they have low profit margins. So
the gun industry absolutely has low profit margins for sure.
So if every gun you're not making that much money, so you have to expend so much energy to make money, and you don't even
you have to sell a lot of guns in order to like have it be a fairly profitable industry.
Right.
And when you think about, like I was saying, you know, how the guns, they don't break very easily if they're well made, right? They're durable goods, like I said. And so how do you keep selling? You get more people to buy, and you get people who have already bought to buy more.
Yeah. Now, I'm just exploring a crazy idea right now, but I mean,
sure.
Probably from your perspective. I mean, I'm not a capitalist. Okay. I'm not like a super capitalist, but if you want to motivate people by their own motivations, right? I mean, I see that people that are like, okay, the best capitalist is the one that thinks long-term, you know, in your long-term well-being. If you want your business to grow, think long-term. Wouldn't there be a case to be made to try to influence the NRA, if this is true, to say for your own financial well-being long-term, it's in your best interest to actually, put money towards toward money and influence towards what's your preferred scenario, NRA? You kind of want lots more guns out there. Okay, I get that. because that's what your business
Cool.
is. And
Right.
you want, okay, I mean, whatever, you could be like, I like that, I don't like that, but let's just say that's inevitably you're going to want to do that because that's your business. Well, what's a scenario where, I mean, it's only going to get more and more, this conversation, you know, get more and more, and all these mass shootings and all the gun violence that happens, if you don't do anything about it, it's going to, the conversation is going to get more toxic, and it would hurt your business. So you should be, out of your own capitalistic self-interest, if you want, the best scenario for you is lots of guns are sold and violence at the same time goes down, because that would probably prove your own narrative that more guns means less violence or something like that. So work on that, whatever that means. NRA, put all your money towards working on making sure that that happens. Is that something anyone?
Well, I mean,
is this?
I think you could make that argument, but that argument sort of rests on the assumption or like reasonableness of their position, right? So like it is dependent on more guns actually really leading to less violence, right? And so if more guns don't actually lead to less violence, then they can't market that as effectively as perhaps they might want to if they tried.
Right. If I were them, I would try to look for that data that more gun looks for less violence. And if it's not there, then what I would do is I would spend money on the long-term stuff to like invest in community programs to alleviate, like whatever, mental health, like everything that would, in the other cultural factors that lead towards, people in those 4 buckets that you were saying, the things that, and so my question is anyone telling them to do that? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like for their own.
I don't know if anyone's telling them to do that. Like, I just don't. There is, like I said, like some data that's very old that gets cited like pretty frequently in like the debates. And so there is, there is data out there, or at least studies out there that say that, more guns means less violence and less crime. It's just, heavily outweighed by scholarship that lands on the other side of the line,
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's in the end, it's money, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think so, but that's just my opinion.
Right. Yeah. What glimmers of hope? I mean, again, you've alluded to some of them, but or maybe I'll say it this way: what work needs to still be done by people like you, by whether it's scholars, activists, like what, things have already been done, things have been tried. What else? I mean, I was just trying to come up with an idea, like, hey,
right.
Tell the NRA, spend your money on the prevention stuff. I mean, that idea. I mean,
that's like hugely great PR for you, right?
Yeah. Hugely great PR for you. You don't even have to agree with the NRA or think that they're great to suggest that they put their money in that way.
Might benefit from something like that, right?
So I mean, that's just an idea. But yeah, what other kind of do you what things need to be tried from where you stand?
I mean, from an academic standpoint, like a scholarly standpoint, like doing the research, I think that going forward, more people need to look at like specifically who it is that gun violence impacts the most, and who is most helped by new policies. So I'm biased here again, because that's basically what I'm trying to do, right? It's saying like these policies have these effects on these groups. I look at race, but you could look at gender, and you could look at sexual orientation. You could look at religious affiliations. Basically whatever you want. And I think when you research those things, you have a better idea as like a policymaker what policies are likely to be helpful in your circumstance, given like your constituencies. So scholarly, I would say we should be looking into that, right? Like, because we know like who bears the burdens of gun violence a lot. Like we know that the Blacks, for example, disproportionately bear the burden of gun homicides, and that whites disproportionately bear the burden of gun suicides. But we don't have a ton of evidence, like the literature is sort of developing, as to, okay, but when we have these preventative policies that are adopted at maybe like the state level, who benefits the most, to what degree does everybody benefit versus just like one group, things like that.
Yeah.
Scholarly, I focus on that. Kind of like practically speaking, I think there's a lot to be done at the state level. That's where a lot of like movement has been happening with sort of inaction on the federal level. So, obviously sort of the same old story, right? Like get involved with groups, state your opinion, the American way, it's democracy, make your voice heard and like really, really get involved. At the same time, on that note, right, like you have all these big organizations like Giffords and Brady and March for Our Lives, excuse me. And they have a lot of power, they have a lot of influence, they have a lot of resources, but they all sort of approach the problem the same way, which is democracy. And I'm not saying that's, that they shouldn't do it that way. I think they should. Democracy is good. Like we can't, I think it's dangerous to fight fire with fire, right? Like we should try to solve this democratically by talking to each other, having dialogue, things like that. At the same time, I think those organizations or maybe even different organizations could be involved in more kind of a direct acts of good trouble, right? Like if we're trying to go up against like the gun lobby or whatever, then you would have sit-ins at gun shows. We have sort of like these more direct forms of protest as opposed to just sort of marches that get a lot of media coverage but don't really bother anyone. And so, just be more creative with your protest strategies, I suppose.
I have a neighbor who is Shane Finkel. He's kind of like I don't know. I think he's coined the term like ordinary radical, right? I think they were in the NRA meeting the other day. I think there was some sort of something where you could go get in there for like a prayer time. I think it was, or it might have been.
Okay.
I'm not sure. But then they had, anyways, you can look it up on social media. But then they tried to have a time of prayer and talking about like the way of Jesus is violence, right? And that's something that I agree with. I mean, I can wade into all the specifics, but for me, something I'm like, at the end of the day, Jesus died on a cross. He didn't crucify other people. Like, there's a way to think about it. We can nuance all these things, but from where I come in my faith perspective, I can't see Jesus crucifying. Jesus would not crucify someone else. Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Yeah.
Others crucifying him, like you crucify me instead. Okay. So, but they kind of, I guess, did like an act of civil disobedience or something, and then they were thrown out. And so it sounds like those kind of things you feel like would be effective.
Well, I mean, I think so things in that vein, perhaps. Not all acts of demonstration are good PR, right? Mm-hmm. Like obviously you sort of want to disrupt the status quo. You want to make people uncomfortable because you want them to pay attention. Like, a protest of some kind isn't going to be effective unless it makes somebody else mad. That said, you need to make the right people mad and get the right people on board with you, right?
Right.
And so if you're looking to, I think, like recruit sympathetic, Christians, Republicans, NRA members, what have you, I think disrupting something like a prayer meeting probably isn't your best bet, and you probably want to be disruptive in some other kind of way.
Sure.
I don't necessarily know exactly what those ways are. I just think that there should be more sort of like direct, disruptive, not violent disruptive, but like, this is not the status quo anymore. Like, pay attention kinds of things. Like a really easy, like simple example, right? Would be a couple of days ago, the New York Yankees and the Rays, right? They used their like Twitter channels, I guess is the word, their profiles, whatever, not to tweet about like the game that was going on that night, which is what they typically do, but instead they just tweeted fact after fact after fact after fact about gun violence in the United States. Right. And so a lot of people were angry that they couldn't follow, the Twitter stream for like the latest details on the game. But at the same time, it was educating people. It was reaching people. People were seeing it. so that like sort of disrupts, you know, the status quo in a way that's not violent, that I think, you know, gets attention and that, you know, serves a good goal at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. And I also wrestle with that because on the other hand, I'm putting myself in the shoes of that person that's like,
of the fan, right?
Yeah, see now, or like the unconvinced person that see now what the leftists are doing. Now they're like, I can't even get baseball anymore. Now you turned everything into like
Right.
left-wing politics and you're just trying to control us, you know? But I also see it's hard to have wisdom about what the tactics are right to, well, for me, you see, my approach is I want to find ways to get us into the room where our temperature is down and we can think through things. And okay, say you have a room of people. This is my last question. If you have a room of people across the spectrum, their temperature is down, they actually want to pay attention to what you have to say. And things that they don't know yet, they've not heard of. Little known realities, right? That are the highest leverage things, the things that you feel like will really show some people. I mean, maybe you've already alluded to some of that. For example, I would imagine that you'd probably say something about the money and that triangle thing really helped me think about NRA, gun manufacturers, and the policymakers. But what would you say are, like, if you had a limited amount of time, what would be those things that you're like, I really want you to take, reasonable
I think I would
to take into account, you know?
I think like the biggest thing I would hammer home, right, is how much gun violence occurs in the US. And that's like listing off like some big stats, right? Like compared to like other high income countries, right? You hear all the time that the gun homicide rate in the US is higher, but it's not like 10 or 15% higher. It's like 25 times higher, right? Like it's just so far and away, like completely detached from like anything else you see anywhere. Something like, so saying that, you know, gun violence is the leading cause of death among like children and teens in the United States, and has been for like a couple of years now, right? Like the leading cause of children and teens. And like that's just absolutely ridiculous. Like something has to be done about that. Yeah, those are probably the two things that I would say. It's like, look, I'm glad we're all here. I'm glad we're all willing to have a conversation. We need to make changes because, you know, the US right now is exceptional in all the wrong kind of ways on this point, right? Lots of people, including like children and kids, you know, are dying, and they don't need to, right? There are things we can do to stop it.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'll just throw this in there. I mean, what I like to start with, what I would like to start with, and want to move towards something about like laws and policies still do matter, is maybe not to throw it in people's faces, but just show that people already do believe that. Again, we can debate that, but if they're just going to throw in your face, well, laws won't change things, changing people's hearts will, right? I mean, that's a common.
Right.
I just start with, well, I think you already believe that laws are important because you want to have these conversations about abortion, and you want to have conversations about whatever. So maybe just not throwing it in people's face as a grenade, but like, well, let's start with, I think we agree that we need to have deliberations about what kind of laws and what kind of laws are helpful and important. Okay, so now what kind of restrictions are helpful? I think if you can get people to the conversation there, restrictions are the necessary, the right kind of restrictions are helpful. Then
maybe another way in, like an entry point for that kind of conversation, being like, all right, well, you got to agree that at least some laws are good, right? There's a quote from Martin Luther King, and I'm going to have to paraphrase because I don't actually know it off the top of my head, but it's something like, laws aren't meant, and they can't, you know, make someone more moral. They can't make them a better person, but they can regulate behavior and keep people from lynching me and people who look like me, right? And so, like, yeah, you do, like, ultimately it would be best, right, if you could change hearts. Like, I think that would be good, but that's not what laws are meant to do. Laws are meant to regulate behavior. And and you want to regulate the behaviors that are dangerous to people and to public health.
Yeah, that's helpful. Well, I don't want to end. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Well, I'll ask you one last thing. Where do you go from here? I mean, I know that you said you finished your PhD and you focused on this, but what are you trying to do next?
What I'm trying to do next is, get involved with sort of like local chapters of advocacy groups. Gifford's, Moms Demand. I volunteered for them for the last couple of months. Done a few small projects for them, just in like the local community. It's really just sort of throw myself into the effort to prevent gun violence, and do the best I can, whether that's through advocacy, more research. Just be like, hey guys, this is an important issue and it needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the efforts that you are trying to do. And I think every person, no matter what perspective, as long as you do care and as long as you're trying to do your way, that is helpful. Even staying in the conversation, perhaps, right? Because probably some of our efforts do cancel each other out. But staying in the conversation and maybe say being open to the other perspective. I hope, so I appreciate your role in that.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation. It's been good. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah.